This video will investigate human impacts on nutrient cycles. Humans are constantly interacting with our environment, and we are constantly manipulating the amounts of nutrients that are found around us. We don't just manipulate these nutrients either. Sometimes we overuse or pollute what's in our ecosystems. We are going to look at some of the human impacts on each of the nutrient cycles we've discussed so far. Remember, in the carbon cycle, our major reservoir is in the atmosphere. Plants take in CO2 and assimilate it so that other organisms can use it. There is a reservoir of carbon in living organisms, as well as in some of the remains of living organisms, such as fossil fuels found under the ground. Humans impact this cycle in two major ways that we are going to discuss. The first is in industry and burning fossil fuels. The second has to do with deforestation. One of the major reasons that global carbon dioxide levels are rising has to do with human use of fossil fuels. Remember, in the carbon cycle, living things contribute to carbon dioxide in the reservoir of the atmosphere. However, plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of that reservoir at a fairly equal rate to what organisms push into it. This keeps things pretty balanced. However, there are other reserves of carbon dioxide in places like fossil fuels and the oceans. Humans have tapped into fossil fuels such as petroleum reserves, and we use these to power many of our everyday processes, everything from cars to factories. When we burn these fossil fuels, we are releasing a lot of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, more than the plants can take out. We also see that deforestation is occurring. When humans cut down trees and forests, there are fewer plants to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So what's the big deal with carbon dioxide? Who cares about a little gas that's already there or adding to that reservoir? The problem is that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. We see that solar radiation, the sun's energy, enters our atmosphere and hits the earth. Some of that light and energy will be radiated back out towards space as heat. The atmosphere keeps some of that heat in, warming up our planet. Greenhouse gases prevent the escape of heat from the earth. This means that we have more re-emitted heat trapped in our atmosphere. This can warm up global temperatures. Historically, we have seen that carbon dioxide cycles. There are high years, low years, and it goes back and forth. We are currently going through a peak period where there is a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere just due to natural processes. However, humans are adding carbon dioxide at a rate that has surpassed any peak that we have seen previously. This data comes from NASA and some of their research. Again, this shows us the overall pattern of how carbon goes up and down throughout the years, and those levels are ever changing. In recent years, we have this spike at an exponential level, leading us to much higher carbon dioxide levels than previously seen. These carbon dioxide levels are corresponding to rises in temperatures globally. This data again comes from NASA and some of their climate research. And we see that from year to year, temperatures can fluctuate, but overall there is a trend of increasing temperatures on a global scale. Moving on to the nitrogen cycle. Remember, the atmosphere has a huge amount of nitrogen stored as into gas. Bacteria help fix that nitrogen, and other bacteria help turn it into forms that plants and animals can use. Some bacteria will return nitrogen to the atmosphere. Some of the waste products, such as nitrous oxide, that are produced during the burning of fossil fuels can pollute clouds and falls as nitric acid in rainwater. Nitric acid and this acidic rain can cause a great deal of damage, particularly to things like plants. We also see that agriculture, farming, and lawn maintenance can affect the nitrogen cycle as well. The use of fertilizers can increase the amounts of nitrogen in the ecosystem. When we fertilize our fields or our lawns, there's usually some runoff of the nitrates present in that fertilizer. The nitrates can wind up in the waterways and add extra nutrients. This is not always a good thing. Sometimes adding extra nutrients leads to very dire consequences. If we look at the phosphorus cycle, remember, much of the phosphate is stored either in the soil or in the rocks. Organisms can take it up. It moves through the food web and then is returned to the soil by bacteria. Agriculture again plays a part in human impacts on the phosphorus cycle. The other major component of fertilizers is phosphates. When these are used, we again see runoff of phosphates into waterways, which can build up and add excess nutrients to that system. Normally, nitrogen and phosphorus are both limiting factors in ecosystems, especially in aquatic ecosystems. This means that these factors can help limit population growth around that carrying capacity. So what happens when we add nutrients and remove that limiting factor? Well, we see that some organisms are going to have population growth, often on an exponential level. Eutrophication is the process that increases nutrients in an ecosystem, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. This leads to rapid growth of algae and bacteria. These organisms consume so much oxygen that it leads to the death of larger animals such as fish. So, the sudden increase of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, in our waterways from the runoff of fertilizers often leads to death of other organisms. It can disrupt an entire ecosystem. The last cycle we looked at was the water cycle. This is when water moves through evaporation into the air. It condenses and falls as precipitation to the land, where it runs off into waterways, or where it can evaporate again. Humans affect waterways by changing water flow and changing the water stores as well. Here's one example of how humans have changed water flow. When we put up cities, after chopping down forests, we see that the runoff from area to area has decreased. There's less groundwater flow to feed things like streams in the area, and more runoff that may be contaminated. This is going to change the levels of evaporation and overall change how water is moving through the ecosystem. Our water usage affects water flow as well. We can pull water for our cities, things like our taps and toilets. We dump wastewater from flushing toilets down the drains or stormwater into waterways, which often contaminates them. Other places are on wells. These wells tap into groundwater and take out much of the reserves that are underground. All of these things change how water moves through the environment. Another way humans affect the water cycle is through deforestation. This affects the water cycle because water moves through plants, especially large trees, into the air in a process called evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration adds to the amount of water in the atmosphere. When you add to that water, we see more condensation and more precipitation as rain. If we deforest an area, much of the water is actually lost as runoff. It leaves that particular area, which means there is less water moving up and evaporating from the plants into the atmosphere. This causes a change in overall precipitation levels. In this example, we see a forest has been chopped down, and as more and more trees are lost, there is less and less rain, causing droughts in the area. There are many ways that humans affect nutrient cycles and impact our ecosystem. It is important for us to pay attention to the nutrient cycles around us and know that how we act affects other organisms and the ecosystem as a whole.